She had covered 3 generations of Israeli politics, from the founding fathers who spoke of making deserts bloom, to the security hawks who promised peace through strength, to the tech entrepreneurs who exported innovation to the world. But nothing had prepared veteran correspondent Sarah Chen for what she encountered in a Tel Aviv startup office on a humid Thursday in September 2023. The young programmer debugging code in front of her, 26 years old, born and raised in Israel, had never heard of the Six-Day War. When pressed, he vaguely knew it had something to do with Jerusalem, but couldn't name a single battle or explain why it mattered. This wasn't ignorance. This was indifference. And this indifference, she realized, was the most revolutionary force in Israeli society since 1948. For 75 years, Israeli identity has been built on a single, overwhelming narrative: survival. Every generation has inherited the same existential questions. How do we defend ourselves? How do we justify our existence? How do we maintain a Jewish state in a hostile neighborhood? But now, for the first time in Israeli history, an entire generation has grown up asking different questions entirely. Why should we care about borders drawn by our grandparents? Why should ancient conflicts define our future? Why can't we just be normal? This shift represents more than teenage rebellion. It signals the potential end of the survival state as we know it. And what comes next might surprise everyone who thinks they understand Israel. The signs of transformation are everywhere, but they're often dismissed by older analysts who mistake style for substance. When hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets in 2023, foreign observers saw familiar patterns. They missed the deeper current, a generational revolt against Israeli exceptionalism itself. Consider Maya Goldstein, a 28-year-old software engineer who became a protest symbol. In interviews, she rarely mentioned security threats. Instead, she spoke about wanting Israel to be a normal country with normal problems. When pressed about regional threats, she would shrug. Every country has hostile neighbors. Why should that define how we live? This attitude would have been incomprehensible to previous generations who inherited trauma and passed it forward, creating intergenerational transmission of survival anxiety. But young Israelis born after 1995 experienced unprecedented relative peace. For them, the survival narrative feels like their parents' obsession with a solved problem. This psychological shift creates a fundamental challenge to the Israeli political system, which remains organized around survival-based assumptions. Right-wing parties promise security through strength. Left-wing parties promise security through peace. But what happens when voters stop prioritizing security at all? The answer is already visible in Israeli polling data. Among voters under 30, the issues that matter most are housing costs, work-life balance, environmental protection, and social equality. Security consistently ranks 4th or 5th. This represents a seismic shift that established parties haven't yet figured out how to address. The generational divide became most apparent during the 2021 Gaza conflict, known in Israel as Operation Guardian of the Walls. While older Israelis rallied around the flag and supported military action, young Israelis increasingly questioned the entire framework. Social media filled with posts asking, "Why are we still doing this? What's the point? When does it end?" These weren't pacifist sentiments exactly, but something more radical. A rejection of the conflict's fundamental premise. Previous generations asked, "How do we win?" This generation asks, "Why are we playing this game at all?" The economic dimension drives this shift. Young Israelis face Tel Aviv housing costs 15 times median salary. Military reserves duty faces growing resistance from high-tech workers earning six figures who question spending weeks in uniform for optional conflicts. Some simply emigrate. Israel's first significant brain drain since the 1950s. The cultural shift is equally striking. Young Israelis see themselves as Middle Easterners, not Western transplants. They listen to Arabic music, speak Hebrew with Arabic phrases, travel to Jordan as tourists. They collaborate with Palestinian entrepreneurs via Zoom, discover shared tastes through social media, create relationships parallel to political conflicts. The political implications of this shift are only beginning to emerge. Traditional Israeli parties, both left and right, struggle to connect with voters who don't share their basic assumptions about conflict and identity. New political movements are emerging that focus on quality of life issues rather than security concerns. These parties attract young voters not by promising to solve the Palestinian conflict, but by promising to ignore it while addressing practical concerns about housing, education, and economic opportunity. The most successful of these new movements is led by politicians who explicitly reject the survival narrative. They argue that Israel's obsession with security has become counterproductive, creating unnecessary conflicts and distracting from real problems. They propose treating Israel like any other developed country, with normal politics focused on normal issues. This approach creates cognitive dissonance among older observers, both Israeli and foreign, who cannot imagine Israeli politics without the conflict at its center. They dismiss young politicians as naive or irresponsible. But the electoral math suggests something different. Voters under 40 increasingly support politicians who promise to normalize Israeli society rather than defend its exceptionalism. The transformation extends beyond politics to military culture, long considered the backbone of Israeli society. Military service remains mandatory, but its social meaning is changing. Previous generations saw army service as the defining experience of their lives. Current recruits increasingly view it as an obligation to complete as painlessly as possible before starting their real lives. This attitude creates practical problems for military planners accustomed to high motivation and social cohesion. Unit commanders report difficulty maintaining discipline among soldiers who see military service as temporary inconvenience rather than sacred duty. Reserve commanders struggle to maintain readiness when reservists prioritize civilian careers over military obligations. The military establishment has responded with programs designed to reinstill traditional values, but these efforts often backfire by highlighting generational differences. Older officers who try to explain why we fight to young soldiers often encounter blank stares or polite indifference. The soldiers will perform their duties competently, but they won't internalize the mission's existential importance. This practical disengagement from military culture reflects a broader psychological shift. Young Israelis don't feel threatened in the way their parents and grandparents did. They see Israel as a successful, powerful country that faces manageable challenges rather than existential threats. They want to focus on building prosperous, fulfilling lives rather than constantly preparing for the next crisis. But perhaps the most significant change is generational attitudes toward Palestinian relations. While older Israelis see Palestinians through the lens of conflict as security threats, peace partners, or moral challenges, many young Israelis simply see them as neighbors with whom they share geography and, increasingly, culture. This doesn't translate into specific political positions about borders or settlements. Instead, it represents a fundamental shift in psychological framework. Rather than asking, how do we solve the Palestinian problem, young Israelis ask, how do we live together in this space? The first question implies separation and resolution. The second suggests integration and accommodation. The implications of this generational shift extend far beyond Israel's borders. For decades, international relations in the Middle East have been organized around the assumption that the Arab-Israeli conflict would remain central to regional dynamics. American foreign policy, European diplomatic initiatives, and UN resolutions all assume that Israeli-Palestinian relations will continue to dominate regional attention. But what happens when Israelis themselves lose interest in this conflict? What happens when the survival narrative that has driven Israeli behavior for 75 years simply fades away through generational change? The early signs suggest a more integrated, normalized Middle East where Israel functions as a regional power focused on economic development rather than territorial defense. Young Israelis who see themselves as Middle Easterners are natural partners for young Arabs who share similar aspirations for prosperity and modernity. They face similar challenges: authoritarian governments, economic inequality, climate change, and have similar tools to address them through technology and entrepreneurship. This convergence creates opportunities for cooperation that transcend traditional frameworks. Instead of peace treaties, we may see organic integration driven by generational change. Instead of formal recognition, practical collaboration that makes conflict resolution irrelevant. The survival state may not end with dramatic transformation. It may simply fade as each generation finds it less relevant. The programmer, who never heard of the Six-Day War, represents the future of a country ready to stop defining itself by trauma and start building something new.